for the A2 economics course, and tonight we're going to focus on the concept of international competitiveness. It's always good to start with a really clear definition of what that term means. If you're revising from various sources, you may come across different definitions, but this is the one that I prefer if you get a question on this very popular topic. I think that competitiveness is essentially a dynamic concept. It's the ability either of a business at a micro level or a country, a nation at a macro level to compete effectively in international markets. So one thinks about the competitiveness of businesses in particular industries or sectors. Google's competitiveness in the market for search engines, for example, and one can aggregate that to think about a country's overall competitiveness in either a regional context, for example, the European Union, or in a global context. Now, one of the current topics at the moment, which I think could be a serious contender for an exam question, is related to this chart. It shows what's happened to the UK's current account position on the balance of payments over the last 10 years. It's been some time since Britain ran a current account surplus, but if you notice carefully, and this is a key point for revision, our current account deficit, that's the net balance in trade in goods and services, investment income and transfers, that deficit has been widening year on year since 2012. In 2014, the current account deficit exceeded 5% of GDP, the highest that's been for perhaps nearly 30 years. Now, to some economists, but not all, to some of them, it's a sign that the British economy is lacking fundamental competitiveness. That's a fairly broad statement to make, as I hope you'll find from this revision session. Competitiveness is not just about the actual balance of payments. It's a much broader, if you like, a holistic concept. So how competitive actually is the UK at the moment? Well, there are various surveys that come out at different points in time. I was reading a survey today from a business school based in Geneva, which said that Britain was down to 19th on a competitiveness league table. But this next slide is perhaps the most widely used, most widely recognized international survey of competitiveness. And it comes from the World Economic Forum, or WEF. Their figures for 2014 placed Switzerland at the top, Singapore came second, and Finland came third. No surprise there. And again, no real surprise to find Germany in fourth place and the world's biggest economy, the United States, in fifth. But Britain was ranked 9th in 2014, and that was actually a one-place improvement on the year before. We've actually been in and around 10th place for the best part of the last decade or so. So broadly speaking, we can count ourselves as one of the 10th most competitive nations in the world, which is clearly a good place to be. This is the table for Europe, sort of top 10 for European countries. Switzerland there in first place, and UK in 9th, just hovering below countries such as Sweden and Norway, Belgium. There are many other countries, of course, in Europe, not featured in this slide. Greece, for example, is in the sort of mid-60s in terms of competitiveness, and Spain in the sort of mid-40s. Now, this league table is based not on one single indicator, such as the balance of payments, but it's calculated using a range of different indicators. In fact, there are 12 major groups, and on this slide, what I've just tried to do is summarize for you the essence of 8 or 9 of them. So on the left-hand side are the key competitiveness indicators. They range, for example, a ranking on the effectiveness of institutions. Does a country have a legal system, for example, that protects property rights, that has a kind of strong hold, a strong handle on corruption? What about the quality of countries' infrastructure, be it energy supplies or the efficiency of their transport networks? They place quite a high weighting too on the overall macroeconomic performance. There's a heavy weighting given in this measure for countries which keep control of inflation, keep steady control of government borrowing, levels of debt, and countries which grow at a sustainable rate. And then we start to bring in a range of other indicators, some of which you'll be familiar with, no doubt, from your study of the Human Development Index. So some health outcomes, mortality rates, life expectancy, that kind of thing. They also have a separate, and I think quite significant, category for higher education and training. A lot of interest, a lot of emphasis in recent times on getting more students, for example, in the UK, to study languages and also study STEM subjects, science, technology, English, and maths. Other indicators, they look at rankings of the degree of contestability and competition in markets, whether countries are open for trade and investment, or are they more protectionist. And they also look at indicators of whether a country is at or close to technological frontiers. How well is a country adapting to new technologies and able to exploit them as they become available? Overall, what we're saying here is that this is a measure of competitiveness which looks at the concept, at the term, in a more holistic, I feel like composite way. Don't just take one indicator. Competitiveness is a much broader concept than that. And I think that's quite an important point to take away in revision. Here's the UK's rankings, again, a selection of the league table position for Britain in 2014. Overall, we were 9th. We scored pretty well when it comes to institutions. Our legal system, for example, is regarded highly. Our banking, financial sector is still regarded pretty highly globally. We actually score quite well at infrastructure, although there's a lot of debate about that at the moment. But we don't score very well, 107th, in fact, when it comes to macroeconomics. And that's by and large the result of high levels of government borrowing and debt. That said, a really strong thing for the UK is our labour market, regarded very highly in the top 5 in the world. And we actually come second. This is our best ranking globally for technological readiness. Partly, I think that's the success in recent times of the app industry and some very, very successful high-tech companies, such as, for example, Shazam and others along the way. So competitiveness in the UK, on some scores we do really well, on others not quite as good. This is a really interesting kind of spidery diagram, taking all of the 12 factors. Britain is now characterized as an innovation-driven economy. It's reached stage 3 of the competitiveness process. Stage 1 goes all the way back to countries, nearly always lower income countries, which are much more factor-driven. And those of you who have studied development economics, no doubt will have covered out of primary product dependence, where countries are essentially dependent on one or a few cash primary products which they extract and then export. Clearly the UK has moved well beyond that. Now, so competitiveness, we've said, is the ability to compete effectively in markets around the world. There are different types of competitiveness. And again, at A level, it's important, I think, to be really clear on the different measures and definitions, so that if you get a question on this, OCR, for example, and Edexcel particularly emphasize competitiveness in their syllabuses. Get a feel for what really matters, and hopefully in the next 5 minutes you'll see that. So fundamentally, the main measure of competitiveness is based on what's called unit labour costs. So countries which have the lowest labour cost per unit of output are said to be the most cost competitive. That's a kind of key starting point to our discussion. However, competitiveness is not just a question of cost and price, and particularly it's not singly to do with labour costs. If it was, countries where labour costs are very high couldn't compete, but clearly they do. So we bring into the discussion, we add to the analysis a range of non-price factors. So product design, product performance, the range of choice and after-sales service, so replacement parts available for consumers, the branding of products, the availability of component parts and peripheral products, etc. It's a whole series of factors which go together to make a business competitive in markets. And these are the non-price factors that are particularly important. Those of you revising for your microeconomics, they're especially important in oligopolistic industries. And it's not just about wage costs, not just about the labour expense involved in producing goods and services. I think if you look at competitiveness in an overall way, it's a great idea to bring into your analysis and discussion the range of non-wage costs that can affect a business's competitive position. So in some countries, for example, there are very strict health and safety laws, environmental standards, which effectively add, certainly in the short term, they add to the costs of production. Some countries, for example, have brought in carbon taxes or some form of carbon emissions trading scheme. Other countries have quite severe taxes on waste products and the disposal of byproducts. In some countries, employment laws act as an extra cost, the cost of hiring and firing labour. And also, crucially, the welfare state can have an effect. The extent, for example, to which businesses have to contribute towards welfare systems or make financial allowance for pensions for their workers. So this slide hopefully gives you the idea that competitiveness is a cost concept. Labour costs tend to dominate. Other costs are important. Always keep in mind that competitiveness also has a non-price component. Focusing just a little bit on labour costs for a second or two. So we narrowed it down a little bit and say, right, what makes a country competitive in terms of the relative unit labour costs? So we'll take some data on different countries and we'll have a look at some figures in a second and say, well, who is gaining competitiveness and who is losing it? Now, typically, a country's relative labour costs will go up either if the exchange rate appreciates against other nations, other countries, because of course you're going to convert it to a common currency, for example, the dollar. So if the pound appreciates against the US dollar, that will make British labour costs look relatively expensive when expressed in dollar terms. Labour costs also tend to go up when wages increase quicker than in other countries, or when labour productivity isn't growing quite as quickly as it is in other nations. So take an overall picture here. Competitiveness tends to worsen when unit labour costs are rising compared to other countries. Here's just a little bit of data to illustrate this, and keep in mind you can always go through this later on the YouTube site. So if you look at the labour cost in 2010 and give that an index number of 100, it's your base value, and then look at unit labour costs in 2014, 4 years later, for these 6 countries, we see some quite interesting developments. When it comes to Germany and the UK, not much has changed. There's been no significant change in unit labour costs. If you like, for the UK and Germany, it's been pretty steady as you go in recent times. Switzerland, however, really interesting. Their currency, the Swiss franc, has been appreciating quite significantly. They've just released a cap on the Swiss franc against the euro, and the Swiss franc has headed off into the stratosphere. Even before that, in 2014, Swiss unit labour costs were 11% higher than 4 years before. So Switzerland's become less competitive. Japan, on the other hand, a depreciating currency, a period of sustained price and cost deflation, their unit labour costs are nearly 25% lower than they were 4 years ago. So Japan perhaps building a more competitive position. Spain, likewise, has also seen quite steady and quite important progress in cutting their unit labour costs. But here it's not the exchange rate, because they're part of the euro. What's happened in Spain is they've had a prolonged period of recession and slow growth, allied to millions of people having to take wage cuts, some price deflation, plus a recovery in productivity in the last couple of years. The result is in Spain, the unit labour costs are something like 11–12% lower than they were 4 years ago. So Spain seems to be making good progress in improving its competitiveness. And on the other hand, New Zealand, a little bit like Switzerland, their strong currency has been a factor driving up their unit costs. So over time, you get some significant changes in relative competitive position. This chart is a way of showing this. Don't worry too much about all the wavy lines. The key thing is really to focus, first of all, on the red line. That's German unit labour costs since 2000. It's going back 13 years. And look how flat that red line is. there's been very little change over a decade or more in their unit labour costs. Now compare that with countries such as Ireland and Greece and Spain. In the first half of that data series, from 2003 to 2007, 2008, their unit costs were rising very quickly relative to Germany. And that basically means that these countries were becoming less competitive inside the single currency area, damaging their macroeconomic performance. Now, since 2009, since 2010, we have seen quite a substantial improvement in the cost competitiveness of countries such as Greece and Spain and Ireland. This is significant. These countries have made big progress in bringing down their relative unit labour costs. But there has been a consequence, and one of them, of course, as you know, is very high rates of unemployment in certain countries such as Greece and Spain. Becoming more competitive is not a cost-free option. We've focused so far on labour costs as the kind of key measure of competitiveness. I think it's true that for the exam at A2, that's what the examiners want you to emphasize: unit labour costs. However, to help your evaluation, you can then straight away say, well, of course, it depends on other factors. So a country could actually be seeing their unit labour costs be going up and on the surface becoming less competitive. But actually other costs could be falling. So it could be the case that the cost of land might be depreciating, or the cost of buying capital equipment, for example. And that's a really quite important evaluation point, that for many businesses, labour costs are not the major expense. Secondly, of course, the exchange rate can affect competitiveness. Now, that's not the case for Greece and Spain and Germany because they share the same exchange rate. So relative costs do become important. But for a country like Poland or even the UK, a depreciation in the exchange rate, sometimes quite suddenly, can act as a significant competitiveness boost to manufacturing producers and exporters in particular. This is a chart showing the exchange rate for the UK. It's not against the dollar or against the euro, it's against a range of currencies. What I really want you to focus on here is what happened to the exchange rate in 2008. We came into the Great Recession and the financial crisis, and the pound fell by more than 20% on a trade-weighted basis. This, for the UK, was quite a significant boost to our competitiveness at clearly a difficult time. And certainly for the last 3 or 4 years, maybe through to 2013, start of 2014, Britain has enjoyed a fairly competitive exchange rate, and that's presumably helped the economy recover. Notice what's happening in 2014. The pound's value, a trade-weighted value against a range of currencies, has been appreciating quite sharply. And this is by some economists seen as a reason why our trade position has been worsening in the last year or so. We just look a little bit beneath the data. That first chart was the whole value of the pound. Of course, you can look at individual currencies, and quite an interesting picture starts to emerge here. If you take the last year, the pound has been appreciating against the euro, it's up by 14% at the end of April compared with a year ago. So you can now get €1.39 to the pound. But the pound has actually been depreciating against the dollar. The pound is down by more than 10% against the dollar. So although it's becoming harder to export into European markets, it's probably easier to export now into American markets. The pound's rising overall, but the evaluation point here is that it can rise and fall at different rates against individual currencies. Almost through the presentation here, I just want to say a little bit about productivity. If you want to become more competitive as a nation, it's quite important to have some solid progress in lifting your output per worker or output per person employed. Lots of stories in the news at the moment about why it is that the productivity in the UK has been so flat in recent times. It's now regarded as one of our major supply-side economic problems. What I've done on this slide is just emphasize for you what I think are 6 main reasons why productivity in the UK hasn't been growing as fast as people hoped. Reading across the top row, first of all, investment as a share of GDP is pretty low. It's about 15% of national income. And some economists are now talking about the idea of what's called capital shallowing. Now, what capital shallowing is there's not enough investment to replace even just worn out, outdated machinery. So workers are having to use aging capital, computers that are slower, and machinery that breaks down more often. And the result is that clearly has a negative effect on their efficiency. For many, many years, Britain hasn't been spending much on research and development, typically less than 2% of GDP. And again, some economists point to that and say this is a factor holding back innovation and holding back productivity growth. Economists at the LSE have pinpointed some weaknesses in management within businesses as a factor, inefficiencies in how you handled your factor resources. And there's always lots of coverage in the media about our infrastructure creaking at the seams, be it road, rail, and slower telecommunication systems, weaker, slower broadband compared, for example, with countries such as South Korea. So infrastructure is an important factor in terms of driving productivity. Labour hoarding is when businesses tend to keep on more workers than they would normally do, either because they're anticipating a recovery in demand, or because they want to avoid all the costs of firing workers and then having to rehire and retrain at some point in the future. Some evidence that quite a few British businesses perhaps have kept on more workers than they would normally do, and that's kind of having a negative effect on output per worker. And finally, there are well-established and well-known gaps in our education system, in training and vocational skills, particularly in industries such as construction and in the higher knowledge industries such as software development and life sciences. So these are some of the factors which economists are suggesting are holding back productivity and therefore acting as a limiting factor on our competitiveness. There's a wider debate as well about whether Britain's competitive position would be either threatened or enhanced by our decision that's coming up in the referendum, probably next year, about whether to stay in the European Union. I just want to pick up a couple of news stories recently. A well-known British business, JCB, uses earth-moving equipment. Their boss came out and said that actually the British economy might do quite well outside the EU. He wasn't particularly worried about it. Now that caused a few ructions. Equally, a couple of days later, an Airbus chief executive, Paul Kahn, was quoted as saying that actually if we left the EU, known as BREXIT, if we decided to leave the European single market, that would actually have a negative effect on the competitiveness of British industry. So I think if you're revising the EU and Britain's relationship with it, and make that connection with the competitiveness debate, it's quite an important issue to talk about. Finally, let's just quickly go through some of the main policies to make our country more competitive. I think these probably apply to most countries. Perhaps there's a little bit more of a focus here on developed nations, such as the UK. Most economists would argue that labour markets, if you can get them to work better, they should help improve competitiveness. For example, investment in better and more effective education and training. We've talked about management quality needing to improve. And some countries have quite a tolerant and open attitude to attracting in the skilled, talented workers from overseas. There is a global battle for talent, and many of those people add to our productivity. We've talked a lot in the webinars this year about the importance of infrastructure, and it certainly seems to be a key theme in the questions that have appeared so far. So the extent to which poor infrastructure holds back a country is well understood. If you can turn that around and make the investments in infrastructure, be it state-funded or privately funded projects, you can, over the long term, make a big difference. I just wanted to pick out a couple of things. One is the question, who is going to pay for the broadband connectivity and capacity with 4G that we'll need in the next few years. And the other emerging story is the idea of the Northern Powerhouse project, which I suppose is the Conservative government's big idea for the next Parliament. This involves, for example, significant investment in rail and transport, other transport, across the east-west continuum from Liverpool to Hull, the Northern Powerhouse project. Generally speaking, more competitive countries are those which get it right when it comes to entrepreneurship, get it right when it comes to encouraging startups and getting the right incentives for innovation. And the Conservative government wants to reduce red tape. It has a mantra that this is holding back small businesses. But generally, I think you can't go beyond the fundamentals of competitiveness. The most successful countries are those which have a degree of macroeconomic stability. They keep inflation low, they have a stable, reliable banking system, and oftentimes they have an exchange rate which actually makes them fairly competitive against their major trading partners. Now, these are all, in many ways, long-term policies. If you get a question on competitiveness, you need to be thinking about policies that move just beyond one economic cycle, sometimes 5, 10, 15 years. So this has been an overview on aspects of international competitiveness. We've talked about what the term means. We've talked about the different types of measurements of competitiveness. We've looked at some of the weaknesses that the UK has in this area, and hopefully you've got a good feel for some of the policy areas that might be successful in keeping the UK right up there in the top 10, but also addressing that balance of payments problem that we talked about right at the start. Keep checking out our website for lots of revision resources and exam support, and obviously all of the webinars are available on the YouTube channel for you to go through at your own pace. But for now, thank you for joining me, and look forward to meeting up again sometime soon.